Chris Harris from Gloucestershire with you again, and my assignment this week, I'm comparing the graphical interface of 4 different synthesizers. Only as you can see, it's not a graphical interface, it's an actual hardware control panel. This is an ARP Odyssey from the late 1970s. So let me talk you through the main features of the Odyssey's control panel. It's got 2 VCOs, or voltage controlled oscillators, VCO1 and VCO2. You can synchronize VCO2 using this switch. Tuning each VCO is accomplished with coarse and fine tuning knobs. Down here are frequency modulation controls. These allow me to apply modulation from the low frequency oscillator to the pitch of the voltage controlled oscillator. So this is where I get vibrato. The next section of the Odyssey's control panel is where we find the low frequency oscillator, or LFO. On the Odyssey you can set the LFO from 0.2 Hz up to 20 Hz. So on the right hand side of the Odyssey's panel you have the remaining controls that we're going to talk about. First of all, there's the voltage controlled filter, which can be controlled either by the keyboard control voltage or from an external source such as a mixer or a pedal. I can also modulate the voltage controlled filter from the low frequency oscillator. The signal chain then goes through a high pass filter to the voltage controlled amplifier. Underneath you can see I can actually select between the 2 envelope controls. I have a very simple attack release envelope generator, or an attack, decay, sustain and release envelope, as we've seen in the lesson. Here we are a few years later on, and design has got a little bit more spiffy. This is a Moog Rogue. Let's start with the oscillators. Again, the Rogue's monophonic, but again it has 2 oscillators, oscillator 1 and oscillator 2. Like the Odyssey, you can synchronize oscillator 2 so that it plays in unison with oscillator 1, but you can also tune it up to an octave away. Very simple waveform selections. It's either sawtooth or square wave, and that's your lot. Like the Odyssey, the Rogue has an LFO. This is the modulation section. I can set the LFO's frequency between 0.3 Hz and 30 Hz, and I can apply it to either the oscillator to get vibrato or the voltage control filter. The remaining controls on the Rogue are pretty basic. Here's my voltage control filter. I've got 3 sliders for cutoff, emphasis and a mount, and that's it. Above it is my envelope control, and as you can see it's labelled contour generator. I've got a slider for controlling the attack. I've got another slider for controlling the decay. My sustain control is either on or off, and that's your lot. On to synthesizer number 3 a few years later. This is a polyphonic synthesizer made by Roland. It's a Juno 60. One problem with analog synths like the Odyssey and the Rogue is that as they heat up, the electrical properties of their circuits change, and that makes the voltage controlled oscillators in their circuits go out of tune. In the Roland Juno 60, instead of a voltage controlled oscillator, we have a digital controlled oscillator. This basically works on the same principle as your digital watch, and it means that it will always stay in tune. The rest of the controls are pretty straightforward. I can select either a sawtooth wave or a square wave, and I can actually alter the relative widths of the up and down parts of the square wave using something called pulse width modulation, which gives a really nice sound. I can even apply a second sub-oscillator to the sound to make it even fatter. As before, I can modulate my DCO signal using the low frequency oscillator, and my low frequency oscillator controls are here. So I've got one for how long it takes before the LFO starts modulating the signal, and one of how fast the LFO operates. The rest of the controls on the Juno 60, I've got a high pass filter, I've got a voltage controlled filter which I can set its frequency and its resonance. I can apply either an envelope or the LFO signal or a keyboard signal to the filter. And then here's my voltage controlled amplifier, and finally my envelope controls. Pretty straightforward: attack, decay, sustain and release. A couple of decades later on and everything's changed, and here we are using touchscreen interfaces on a Korg M3. But as you can see, it's still got 2 oscillators. I can choose whether the second oscillator is synchronized to the first oscillator. I've still got a low pass filter that I can apply to the output of the VCOs. I can control how vibrato from the low frequency oscillator is applied to the voltage controlled oscillators. I've still got a voltage controlled amplifier. And I've still got an envelope generator for the output of the voltage controlled amplifier, which has attack, decay, sustain and release control. Thanks for coming with me on this journey through synthesis. Even though I've been playing synths for about 40 years, I learnt a lot this week, but perhaps the biggest lesson that I learnt was the more things change, the more they stay the same.